I am floating in the River Lum, found inside the city of Lumbridge in an old game called Runescape. And what if I told you that this river makes no sense at all, and shouldn't even exist? This is just one of many different rivers found in the world of Gielinor, and today I pose the question: are RuneScape's rivers realistic? I'm not just talking about how they look, because honestly they all look terrible, but I'm talking about whether or not they make any hydrological sense at all. Let's find out. We're going to start in the gloomy swamplands of Mauritania, where just north of Darkmire is a green bubbling river. The source of this nasty water, unsurprisingly, comes from the Mauritania swamp itself, which actually makes it a blackwater river. Down here at the mouth, we can see a couple of things. First, you can see the gross and likely toxic water pouring into the aptly named Gravewater Bay, which makes this water only marginally safer than the tap water found in Flint, Michigan. Second, you can also find the Alaviz Estuary, which is a partially closed-off section of brackish water with one or more rivers flowing into it. Definitely a nice touch, and I'd say this river seems pretty realistic to me. And this is the River Salve, right on the western edge of Mauritania, dividing it from Misthalin, and it's super weird. The lower half is mostly fine, except for this curiously shaped alcove. The upper half, however, is where it starts to get confusing. Here by the northeastern corner of the dig site, we find a confluence that splits to the west and to the north. Looking to the west, we can see a massive sailboat. Holy! How'd they even get this thing here? Now, I'm no master of sailing yet.
Nice.
But I do know that this boat doesn't stand a chance making it out of this river unless it wants to cosplay as the Evergiven blocking the Suez Canal for about 6 days. Speaking of canals, what even is this canal anyways? Typically, a canal is made for ships like this to help with transporting goods from one place to another, like the Suez Canal, for example. But assuming this guy is about 6 feet tall, these crates are roughly half his height, so we'll say about 3 feet wide, and these gaps between the cracks are about the width of a crate, and since there's 38 gaps that make up the length of this canal, that makes it approximately 114 feet long, give or take 40 feet or so. So at best, they built this entire canal just to cover a distance of 150 feet. But why? If ships were planning on making their way to the dig site for transporting dirt or valuables, they could have just done it along the main path, rather than digging up or finishing this rectangular abomination that's about as useful as a DVD rewinder. Checking out the tributary coming from the north, it just leads around this corner to the source of this river, which just so happens to be this guy. That's right, all of the water that flows through the River Salve just sort of comes out of the bottom of this statue. I don't think I have to clarify much here. The River Salve is not realistic. Moving on. On the southeastern corner of the map, we can find the island of Mostly Harmless. Now, this island is home to exactly 2 things: a terrible minigame called Trouble Brewing, and a really weird-looking river. There seem to be 2 sources where the river begins, one from the northeast and the other from the northwest. Neither of these really make any sense, since the water just sort of comes out of the ground for some reason, like worms in the spring. Not to mention that the source of this river is at the same elevation as the ocean. I know this world is magical, but unless there's been a new spell that permanently suspends the laws of physics or something, this river is not realistic. Or is it? I mean, sure, this doesn't really bode well for being a realistic river, but how do we know that this is trying to be a river? A good way to check is to see if the water is flowing in a particular direction. But given the water in this game looks like this, we can't really tell. However, if we assume that this water isn't actually flowing, that turns this weird, unrealistic river into a pretty realistic tidal creek, which is a small, winding waterway affected by the ocean tides. That means that at low tide, you would likely see a tidal creek like this almost completely dry up, as the source of this body of water isn't over here like a river would be, but rather the source is the ocean itself. Given this makes a lot more sense, I'm pretty confident in saying that this is probably not a river. The Caridian Desert is a massive, harsh landscape, divided by its most important resource, the River Elid. Starting at the source, this river gets its water from the base of the Giant's Plateau, likely from an aquifer just below the surface that collects rainwater through the ground of this entire plateau. Moving downstream, you can find this suspicious little alcove. This is pretty standard when you have a depression or basin along a river's path. It ends up filling up with water from the river. A good example of this is off the west side of the Nile River, where you can find the Fayum Oasis, which is just a large basin that's filled in with water from the Nile. Continuing down to the entrance of Sophanum, there's an even larger disconnected body of water just off the side of the river. But this likely only fills in when the water level is higher due to increased rainfall. Finally, the river concludes into a triangular collection of landmasses at the end of a river called a delta. Given all the little details, the River Elid is without a doubt realistic, and is probably one of the most realistic rivers in the entire game. Oh my god, I forgot about the video! On this new island, the Great Conch, lies one new river that originates from a lake northeast of the summer shore. Water from the Tortugan Lake then flows down a couple waterfalls and ends up in the Sea of Shells. Now you're probably thinking, how does the lake not run out of water? Well, lakes like this are typically found within a large drainage basin, which in this case would likely be this entire plateau. This allows all the rainwater for this entire area to make its way down to this lake through the ground, which is exactly how Lake Itasca feeds the upper Mississippi River in Minnesota, and is very realistic. If you look at the map, you'll find a narrow strip of water that looks kind of like a river at first glance too, but when given a proper look, it doesn't really have any characteristics of a river other than it's full of water. In fact, this actually looks more like the tidal creek or slough that we found in Mostly Harmless, which means that this too is likely not a river. And here we are, back in the famous River Lum. Remember? What if I told you that this river makes no sense at all, and shouldn't even exist? Well, here's why. The lower half of the river is pretty standard, although the mouth of the river does flow into this shallow body of brackish water that is mostly separated from the ocean called a lagoon. Moving north past the two iconic bridges of Lumbridge, there's also a water wheel that seems to be powering this farmer's hopes and dreams. Further upstream, we find a third and even a fourth bridge that's really silly looking. It kind of looks like they just used the asset for half of a stone doorway and said, "F it, we ball." This isn't the reason that this river makes no sense at all. This is. That's right. The entirety of this river is supplied by water that just sort of comes out of this inexplicable hole in the wilderness. There's no lake, no swamp, no aquifer, not even an elevation change. This is just the equivalent of a Minecraft water source block, which I'm sure anybody could agree doesn't really make any sense at all. Contingent on this fact, this iconic river shouldn't even exist, and yet, here it is. One of the rivers of all time, featuring a bunch of bridges. Wait a minute. Lum Bridge! Like the River of Lum with bridges on it! That's a big... Next up is the island of Karamja, which has two river systems to explore. Starting with the smaller one, we have this little guy off the western coast. It starts off as a small lake which flows into this, cave-looking thing. It sort of looks like a culvert, which is typically a pipe-shaped structure built to allow a stream or river to pass underneath a road. What I don't understand, however, is why this is even here. Typically, bridges are more expensive to construct versus a culvert, but surely this small wooden bridge would be significantly easier to build compared to this giant thing, right? I don't know, I guess I've never built one myself. Coming out the other side, the river then terminates into another delta off the Strait of Khazard. I also find it hard to believe that a tiny river like this could create a delta this large. But I do actually have a theory that might explain both of these anomalies. But we gotta check out the other river system first. This one is actually quite interesting, and there's more going on here than initially meets the eye. If you just look at the map, this whole system of rivers makes no sense. There's no clear start or end or even a flow path. It almost just looks like a continent just being split up by a bunch of narrow oceanic straits versus a flowing river system. But when you actually explore this area in-game, everything starts to fall into place. This lake is actually the source of 3 separate rivers, which makes this a triple divide, which is a rare phenomenon where 3 separate watersheds meet. One famous example of this is found at Glacier National Park in Montana, where you can find Triple Divide Peak. Starting with the smallest watershed off the eastern side of the divide, there's a simple waterfall which then flows directly into the Caribbean Sea. The northern watershed contains the River Amja, which just follows a fairly realistic path through the jungle until it makes its way into the Musa Passage. Finally, the eastern watershed containing the River Shiloh unsurprisingly cuts right through the center of Shiloh Village, where it awkwardly wraps around the Cairn Isle before ending up in the Felden Gulf. But what if it didn't? I theorize that the River Shiloh didn't always cut straight through the center of the village like this, but rather used to flow northwest into the river-shaped body of water we looked at earlier. This would certainly explain the formation of a delta this size, and this would also explain why somebody would build this rudimentary method of traveling over the river. Maybe it wasn't the people of Shiloh Village at all, but rather it was their ancestors, some of which might not have had the tools or engineering prowess to build something like a wooden bridge. But if this was the case, then why did the river change its direction in the first place? It's hard to say. Something like this can occur due to some environmental or geographical change. Or perhaps there was something important found below the river, like a valuable resource, for example, and the river was diverted manually by these ancestors in order for them to harvest it. I reckon we'll never really know, but if this is the case, that makes these 3 rivers pretty realistic. And in turn, that makes this river up here not a river at all, but rather just the remnants of an abandoned river delta, which would make it a slough. Pretty cool, huh? Heading over to Ape Atoll, you can find a pretty unique-looking river that originates right at the tallest point of the island. This lake then flows down a neat little waterfall and makes its way around until it eventually spits out into this rather large estuary connected to the Arrow Passage in the Ardent Ocean. Luckily, there isn't anything too complicated here, and I would say this is definitely realistic enough. This estuary do kind of look like a fish, though.
Island Lightning Round!
Hey, that looks like a river! Nope, it's another slough. Okay, now that's gotta be a river. Nope, it's a ford. Fjord? Fjord. Alright, for real this time. This is a proper little river system on Lunar Isle, and it all starts from the only examinable water source in the game, which says it's a natural spring. Downstream, there are a couple little waterfalls that eventually flow right into the Piscataway Sea. This one seems pretty decent, although it is pretty uncommon to see a river split like this. Typically, rivers will converge together like the Amazon River system you can see here, since water's pretty good at finding the path of least resistance. But considering this river is so small, I'll give it a pass and we'll say it's reasonably realistic. Back on the mainland, the Kandarin region has several rivers that we need to take a look at. Starting with the river system surrounding the Sinclair Mansion, this river ends here, just past the bridge leading you to Relica, where it spits out into the Vesmos? Vemeshajos. Heading upstream, we can see a confluence that splits to either side of the Sinclair Mansion, where we can find the two sources of this river, which are the Merwick Lake and the Sears Eye Lake. This one's pretty boring, but it's realistic enough. South of the Vegemestahos, you can find the Lake Hemenster, which is home of the shortest river in the entire game. This little guy's just a whopping 28 tiles wide, so there's not really much to be said, to be honest. Water goes from a lake and into the ocean. Seems realistic to me. And then there's the River Doyne. Buckle up, fellas, this is a good one. Up at the top of the Backstorian Falls, you can find the Source, which is a lake with a giant whirlpool in the middle of it for some reason. Heading downstream, you'll eventually get to the Backstorian Falls themselves, which have this weird rock with a tree somehow growing on top. Have you ever noticed this? Well, if you have, did you also notice these two? What about this one over here? What even is this? I can't imagine this was done on purpose. This one isn't even touching the ground! Anyways, continuing downstream going through Ardoyne, there is something here by the Ardoyne Zoo that is entirely inexplicable. But we'll come back to it here in a little bit. Making our way past the observatory, we can find a really strange junction where the river somehow splits into 3 different paths, but 2 of them sort of loop back onto each other, and it seems really unnatural. My theory for this is that someone started digging out a moat to surround the Castle Wars arena, but for some reason just stopped before they could finish the project. Maybe they figured it wasn't worth the effort or something, it's hard to say. But the final path just leads down to the end of the river, which spits out into the backwater near Zulra's shrine. This river doesn't seem too bad. Maybe there's a couple weird rocks or a failed moat project at the end. Surely this river is realistic enough, right?
Wrong!
Let me show you what I found by the Ardoyne Zoo. As you make your way downstream from the Backstorian Falls, you'll eventually run into this. Somehow, the water here is flowing in the complete opposite direction. And if you manage to go a bit further, you'll find the water flow changes again, back to the original direction. That doesn't make any sense at all. I think the only way to really explain this is that it was in fact a mistake by the developers. It's a pretty cool find and a fun bit of trivia, but it does mean that the River Doyne is in fact not realistic. Heading over to the Treenome Stronghold, there's a single river here on the western edge called the River Cranmore. The source looks to be another lake, like most of the rivers found in Gielinor, and it just meanders north until it terminates into the Grand Route Bay. There are a few interesting things that I found here though, like how the support beams for the bridge continue beyond the waterline, even though you wouldn't be able to see this in-game. I also found this whole section of the lake isn't fenced off at all. But there are these wooden posts here on the eastern side. Maybe they started building a fence, but they stopped midway for some reason, like the moat project around the Castle Wars arena. What is it with these people not finishing projects? I'm thinking ADHD is likely canon to the lore of RuneScape. I also found the flowing water texture they used here is the same they used for the Backstorian Falls, which is different from almost all the other flowing water textures in the game. With all that being said, as far as realism goes, this river checks out. Just west of the Arendar Mountains, you can find the elven region of Tiranwyn, which is home to a single river named Afon Ganol. If you speak Welsh, you might have recognized that this can be directly translated to Middle River. And if you happen to live in Wales, you might also know that there's a river in northern Wales named Afon Ganol. The one in RuneScape terminates into the Western Ocean, right near the portal of Amlod for the Gwyneth Glide. Heading upstream, you can see it meandering quite a bit until we hit the source of the river, which is, this little spot at the bottom of the Arendar Mountains. Uh-oh. That doesn't seem very realistic. Psych! Believe it or not, this actually is pretty realistic, as many rivers originate from an aquifer, which is commonly found in mountains. It does look a little bit weird, though. Our last stop for the day is the Kingdom of Great Corrend. We'll start on the northeastern corner of the region, where we can find the River of Souls. So, I know that this says this is a river and everything, but, there's no water in here. This is actually an interdimensional river of ectoplasm that's meant to carry the souls of the dead, and what you see here is actually only part of it. Another portion can be found over in Cerberus' arena, who's actually meant to be the guardian of the River of Souls. Additionally, according to the Sage, this river is the canonical connection between the normal world and the alternate worlds like Leagues, which is super cool, but none of it is realistic, so we'll keep going. Next up is the River Hos, which is found near the Corrend Castle. This river has two mouths, one near Port Piscarilius and the other spilling into the Crabclaw Bay at the south. Head upstream from Port Piscarilius and you can find a small oxbow lake, which happens when a river changes course over time, leaving behind a small pond or lake where a river used to flow. Moving further along, we can find the junction where the river splits into two, which, like I said before, is pretty uncommon in real life. Beyond this, the river becomes a decent-sized lake, which is then supplied from the north from this, random hole in the southern entrance of the castle. Clearly this doesn't make any sense, and therefore it's not realistic. Or is it? If you look to the western side of the castle, you can find another body of water that starts as what looks to be a natural hot spring near Lovakenge. The spring water then makes its way down through a small culvert under the western entrance of the castle, and finally ends up going through a hole facing east. If you continue following where the water could go, it's easy to speculate that this might actually be the source of the River Hos. I can't be so sure, especially since the height where the spring water enters the cave is quite a bit lower than where the River Hos seems to start. Also, I'm sure some of you have already noticed, but why is the spring water so blue? This is the only decent-sized body of water that looks even remotely close to this. And it even looks like this on the minimap, as basically everything else either looks like this, or if it's a swamp, it looks like this. Does this mean that this water is somehow different to everything else, and that proves that it isn't a part of the River Hos? Or is it just another mistake by the developers and they forgot to add a layer to the texture of this particular section of the water, and they didn't realize or care that the height of these caves didn't quite line up? Perhaps we'll never know, but due to the color discrepancy and the fact that rivers generally can't flow uphill, I'm afraid I'm still gonna have to say this river is not realistic unless I'm missing something. Finally, our last river of the day can be found near Mount Quidamortem. Or rather, the source is a lake literally right on top of it. The River Mulch makes its way down a few waterfalls, whose textures actually manage to combine both the standard moving water texture and the moving droplet texture found on the Backstorian Falls. Further downstream, we find yet another junction where the river manages to split directions. But I think I might actually have an explanation for this, so bear with me here. The southern path creates the Lacerta Falls, which flow directly into the, Great Sound.
Damn right.
This waterfall actually seems to be missing a block of texture, but it is kinda neat to be able to see how each texture layer is entirely separate from one another. I don't know about you, but I really love finding little clues like this that give you a hint of how the game was made. Kinda cool. Checking out the northern path, this leads directly into Lake Mulch, which, wait a minute. The river looks like it's supposed to extend this way, but the river was blocked off. In fact, if you head down a bit more, it looks like it was blocked off again in order to build this walkway. Well, I think I have another theory as to what's going on here. From what I can tell, it definitely looks like river mulch used to flow in this direction. But I believe the river was indeed blocked off for one reason or another. This blockage isn't without consequence, however, and the continuous flowing water raised the water level to a point where it filled this entire area and turned into Lake Mulch. You can actually see these little patches of land that are just barely proud of the waterline, which haven't quite been covered with water. I also speculate that the Lacerda Falls weren't always here either, but they were another consequence of the river blockage. With the rising water level, the water would start to pool up around here too, until it eventually found another path off this cliff. I think given this discovery, this river is definitely realistic, and who would have thought that this little investigation would unlock a bit of insight into this area's history? So where does that leave us? Well, we just looked at 23 different bodies of water. 18 of them were rivers, 4 were sloughs or tidal creeks, and 1 was a fjord. Of those 18 rivers, we determined 13 of them to be realistic, or about 72%. That gives us a realism rating of C-, which is far from perfect, but that's still a passing grade, which means that, yes, the rivers of RuneScape are in fact mostly realistic. Thank you so much for watching. What's that? Oh, I didn't talk about any of the rivers in Varlamore. Well, I've got a whole video about the rivers of Varlamore. You'll just have to go watch that one. Okay, bye!